Hey guys, tonight we begin with something soft, dusty, and a little bit mysterious, the kind of story that doesn't crash or explode, but instead just sort of drifts away. So go ahead, dim the lights a little, get comfortable. Maybe pretend you're sitting beside a slow, ancient river that has absolutely no intention of explaining itself. Tonight, we're talking about the collapse of the Indus Valley Civilization, which, to be honest, didn't really collapse in the dramatic movie scene sense. No sudden fire, no final battle, no tragic king yelling into the wind. Just a slow, quiet unraveling. Because of course it did. The Indus Valley Civilization, sometimes called the Harappan Civilization, was one of the earliest urban societies in human history. It stretched across what is now modern-day Pakistan and northwest India. And at its peak, around 2500 BCE, it was weirdly impressive. Not loud impressive, not pyramid impressive, more like calm, organized, quietly superior. Cities like Mohenjo-daro and Harappa were laid out in neat grids. Streets were straight. Houses were standardized. Drainage systems were, honestly, better than what some places have today, which is always a little humbling. Imagine living in a world where people 4,000 years ago had a better sewage system than you. Now, what's interesting is that, unlike many other early civilizations, the Indus people didn't leave behind massive statues of kings or giant inscriptions bragging about how great they were. No, I conquered everything energy. No, I am chosen by the gods. Monologues carved into stone. Just bricks. Streets. Wells. Baths. It's almost like they were more interested in making life comfortable than making themselves look important. A bold choice, historically speaking. We don't even know who their rulers were. There's no clear evidence of kings, queens, or dynasties. No royal tombs filled with glittering treasure. No dramatic family trees full of questionable marriages. Which, if you've been around historical elites for a while, feels suspicious. Because usually, wherever humans gather in large numbers, someone eventually decides they're in charge, and then marries their cousin about it. But the Indus people? They kept things strangely low-key. Their cities were full of uniform houses, suggesting a kind of social balance. Not perfectly equal. Of course, this is still humanity we're talking about. But there's less obvious inequality than in places like ancient Egypt or Mesopotamia. No giant palaces towering over tiny huts. No obvious, this guy thinks he's better than everyone architecture. Just a lot of carefully made bricks. And yet, despite all this quiet competence, the civilization didn't last. Let's slowly drift into the beginning of the end. Around 1900 BC, things started to change. Not dramatically. Not overnight. Just subtly. Some cities began to shrink. Trade networks weakened. The standardized weights and measures, once so reliable, started to vary. Which is never a great sign. It's like when a modern society stops agreeing on basic things, and suddenly everything feels slightly off. At Mohenjo-daro, the once meticulously planned streets began to show signs of neglect. Buildings were repaired, but not always well. Some structures were divided into smaller units, like people were adjusting to tighter conditions. You can almost picture it. A family quietly turning one spacious home into several cramped ones. Not because they want to, but because they have to. No announcement. No official statement. Just adaptation. And then there's the water. The Indus Valley Civilization depended heavily on rivers, especially the mighty Indus River and its shifting network of tributaries. These rivers were both life-giving and, occasionally, a little unpredictable, because rivers, much like people, tend to do whatever they want. There's evidence that some rivers began to change course. Others may have dried up or become less reliable. Flooding patterns shifted. In some areas, repeated floods left layers of silt that made rebuilding harder each time. Imagine rebuilding your house again and again and again because the river just won't behave. At some point, you stop calling it home improvement and start calling it, why are we still here? Climate may have played a role too. There are signs of a gradual drying trend in the region. Not a sudden drought that wipes everything out, but a slow reduction in rainfall. The kind of change that doesn't panic you at first, just makes things slightly harder. Crops don't grow quite as well. Water sources become less predictable. Trade becomes less reliable. And over time, all those slightly worse conditions start to stack up. Human societies are surprisingly resilient until they're not. And then they just sort of thin out. People begin to leave. Not in a dramatic mass exodus. No long lines of refugees stretching across the horizon. Just small groups. Families. Individuals. Quietly deciding that maybe life would be easier somewhere else. Some moved eastward, toward the Ganges Plain. Others drifted into smaller rural communities. The big cities, the pride of the civilization, slowly lost their populations. Imagine walking through Harappa as it empties. The streets are still there. The wells are still there. The drainage system is still quietly doing its job. But fewer voices, fewer footsteps, less life, and no one writing down why, which is perhaps the most frustrating part, because humans are usually very good at leaving behind opinions. Endless opinions. Yet here, silence. We have their seals, their pottery, their tools. We even have their script, still undeciphered, just sitting there, being unhelpful. But no clear explanation. No final chapter. Just a gradual fade. Now, some earlier theories suggested dramatic invasions. The idea was that outsiders swept in and destroyed the civilization. Because, of course, historians love a good dramatic ending. But modern evidence doesn't really support that. There's no widespread destruction layer. No clear signs of violent conquest on a large scale. No cinematic final battle. Which, honestly, feels very on brand for this civilization. Even their ending is understated. Instead of a single cause, it's more likely a combination of factors. Environmental changes, shifting rivers, economic decline, gradual migration, a slow unraveling of a very carefully woven system. And maybe that's what makes it feel so human. Because most endings in real life aren't dramatic. They're quiet. They happen over time, bit by bit, decision by decision, until one day, you look around and realize the thing that once felt permanent isn't there anymore. The Indus Valley Civilization didn't vanish into thin air. Its people didn't disappear. They adapted. They moved. They changed. Their culture flowed into later societies in the region, influencing traditions, practices, and ways of life. So, in a way, they didn't end. They just stopped being what they were. And maybe that's the softest kind of collapse there is. Not destruction. Just transformation with a hint of confusion. And a lot of unanswered questions. Let's gently drift forward from here, because As it turns out, this wasn't the only time a civilization quietly unraveled while everyone was just trying their best to deal with slightly worsening conditions. Humans have a bit of a pattern with that, and we'll meet a few more of those patterns very soon. So we left things in a quiet sort of decline. No dramatic collapse. No final speech. Just a slow, almost polite unraveling of one of the world's earliest urban civilizations, which honestly feels very on brand for the Indus Valley. Now, let's drift a little deeper into one of the main characters in this story, the rivers. Because if you build an entire civilization around water, it's probably a good idea if the water continues to cooperate. And for a long time it did. The Indus River system was generous. Seasonal floods brought fresh silt, making the land fertile. Crops grew. Cities expanded. Trade flourished. Everyone was hydrated and relatively happy. But rivers are not known for their loyalty. Over time, something began to shift. Not in a dramatic, the river disappears overnight kind of way that would be too easy. Instead, the changes were slow, subtle, almost passive-aggressive. Some researchers believe that one of the major rivers connected to the civilization, the Gagar-Hakra system, began to dry up or change course. This river is sometimes linked to the ancient Sarasvati River mentioned in later texts, although that connection is debated, to put it politely. Historians love a good debate. It keeps things lively. What matters here is that water sources became less reliable. And when your entire agricultural system depends on predictable flooding, less reliable is not exactly comforting. Imagine planning your year around a river that suddenly starts showing up late, or not at all. It's like depending on someone who slowly stops answering your messages. At first you think, maybe they're just busy. Then eventually you start making backup plans. In places like Mohenjo-daro, there's evidence of repeated flooding followed by rebuilding. Flood, rebuild. Flood, rebuild. Which sounds admirable until you realize how exhausting that must have been. There's only so many times you can clean mud out of your house before you start reconsidering your life choices. And while some areas dealt with too much water, others may have faced the opposite problem. A gradual decline in monsoon intensity likely reduced rainfall across parts of the region. Fields that once produced steady harvests became less dependable. Again, not a sudden disaster. Just slightly worse yields. Slightly harder farming. Slightly more stress. And those slightly problems tend to accumulate. Now let's gently slide over to trade, because the Indus Valley Civilization was not isolated. They had connections. Archaeological evidence shows trade with regions as far as Mesopotamia. Indus seals have been found in places like Mesopotamia, which means people were moving goods, ideas, and probably a fair amount of opinions back and forth. Trade is one of those things that quietly holds everything together, until it doesn't. As environmental conditions shifted, maintaining long-distance trade likely became more difficult. Rivers changing course can disrupt transport routes. Agricultural decline can reduce surplus goods available for exchange. And once trade starts to weaken, cities feel it. Because cities, despite their impressive organization, are a bit high maintenance. They rely on steady supplies. Food, materials, people, everything needs to keep flowing. When that flow slows down, cities don't immediately collapse. They just struggle. At Harappa, we see signs of this gradual shift. The neat urban planning begins to loosen. Standardized construction, gives way to more irregular building patterns. It's like the city slowly stops trying to impress anyone, which, honestly, is relatable. The famous standardized weights and measures, once a hallmark of the civilization's precision, start to vary. That suggests a breakdown in centralized control or coordination. Or maybe people just stopped caring as much. Either way, it's not ideal for a system built on consistency. Now here's where things get quietly interesting. Despite all these changes, there's no strong evidence of widespread panic. No mass graves. No sudden abandonment across all sites. No signs of people running around screaming, "This is the end," which is both comforting and slightly unsettling, because it suggests that, at the time, this didn't feel like a collapse. It probably felt like life getting a bit more complicated, a bit more uncertain, a bit less predictable. And humans are very good at adjusting to that. We complain, of course, probably a lot, but we adjust. Families may have started moving out of large cities into smaller settlements. Rural areas become more appealing when urban systems start to strain. Less infrastructure, but also fewer problems tied to that infrastructure. It's a trade-off. And slowly, over generations, the population spreads out. The great urban centers, once the pride of the civilization, become less central, less necessary, less alive. Now let's pause for a moment and appreciate just how strange this is compared to other ancient civilizations. Take ancient Egypt, for example. When things went wrong there, we often see clear disruptions tied to political instability, invasions, or dramatic environmental events. Same with Mesopotamia. There are records. Kings complaining. Wars being fought. Someone always writing down how everything is going terribly. But the Indus Valley? Nothing. No written accounts we can read. Their script remains undeciphered, which means all their thoughts, worries, and daily frustrations are locked away in symbols we still can't understand. They could have been writing, "The river is ruining everything," or "Please stop building near the floodplain," or even, "We should have moved years ago." But we don't know. And that silence makes everything feel softer, more distant, more open to interpretation. Now, there's another layer to this slow decline social structure. Earlier, we mentioned how the Indus Valley Civilization doesn't show strong evidence of extreme hierarchy. No massive palaces. No obvious ruling elite dominating the landscape. Which sounds nice. Very balanced. Very calm. But here's the thing. Highly organized systems without clear centralized authority can be delicate. If coordination starts to break down due to environmental stress, economic shifts, or population movement, there may not be a strong central force to pull everything back together. No king to issue orders. No empire to enforce stability. Just communities figuring things out on their own, which works until it doesn't. And so, instead of a dramatic collapse led by the fall of a ruler or dynasty, we get something much quieter. Decentralization. Fragmentation. People adapting in smaller, more localized ways. It's less of a fall and more of a drift. Now, imagine walking again through Mohenjo-daro during this period. The buildings are still there. The streets still form their careful grid. But maybe there's less maintenance. A blocked drain here. A cracked wall there. Someone fixes it, but not quite as well as before. Because maybe the skilled workers have moved away. Or maybe resources are tighter. Or maybe it just doesn't feel as important anymore. And that's how cities begin to fade. Not with destruction, but with neglect, with shifting priorities, with people slowly deciding that their future might lie somewhere else. And eventually enough people make that decision that the city can't sustain itself. So it shrinks and shrinks until it's no longer a city at all, just ruins, which thousands of years later we'll walk through and try to piece together like a very slow, very quiet puzzle. Now, before we drift onward, there's one more thing to gently consider. The idea of collapse itself. We like neat endings, clear explanations, a single cause we can point to and say, that's what did it. But the Indus Valley Civilization doesn't really give us that satisfaction. Instead, it offers something more realistic. A reminder that complex systems don't usually fail for just one reason. They fade because multiple small pressures build up over time. Environmental changes, economic shifts, social adjustments, each one manageable on its own, but together a little too much. And so, without any grand finale, one of the world's earliest urban civilizations simply transitions into something smaller, something different, something less visible but still very much human. Let's gently continue from here, because even after the cities faded, the people didn't vanish. They carried their habits, their knowledge, and their quiet resilience into new landscapes. And that next chapter is less about endings and more about what comes after. Alright, let's keep drifting. The cities have thinned out. The streets are quieter. The carefully planned grids of Mohenjo-daro and Harappa are still there, but they're no longer the center of everything. Which leaves us with a slightly awkward question. What happens to a civilization when it stops being a civilization? And the answer is, unsurprisingly, it becomes people again. Just people. Not urban planners of an advanced Bronze Age society. Not members of a major trade network. Not even participants in a standardized system of weights and measures. Just families, farmers, craftspeople, trying to figure out where the water is going to come from this year. Because once the big systems weaken, trade routes, city infrastructure, coordinated planning, life doesn't end. It just gets smaller, more local, more manageable in a slightly resigned kind of way. So instead of massive urban centers, we begin to see an increase in smaller rural settlements. Villages spread out across the region, especially toward the east, in areas that would later become part of the Ganges Basin. It's less glamorous, but probably more practical. And honestly, after years of unpredictable floods or unreliable rainfall, the idea of a smaller, more flexible lifestyle might have sounded appealing. No massive drainage system to maintain. No large-scale coordination required. Just land, water, and the hope that both behave themselves. Which, to be fair, is still a bit optimistic. Now here's something quietly fascinating. Even though the cities declined, certain cultural elements continued. Pottery styles evolved, but didn't vanish. Some technologies persisted. Agricultural practices adapted. It's not a clean break. It's more like a gradual shift in identity. Imagine someone moving from a big, organized city into a quieter rural life. They don't suddenly forget everything they knew. They carry habits with them. Ways of building, ways of cooking, ways of thinking. And over time, Those habits blend with new environments, new challenges, and new communities. That's what seems to have happened here. The Indus Valley Civilization didn't disappear. It diffused, which is a very calm way of saying it quietly spread out and became harder to recognize. Now, of course, historians and archaeologists would really love a bit more clarity. A helpful inscription would be nice. A detailed diary. Maybe a slightly dramatic letter complaining about the weather. But no. Instead, we get fragments, clues, and a script that still refuses to be read. The Indus script appears on seals and small objects, often alongside animal motifs, bulls, elephants, and some creatures that look like they might have been imagined after a long day. But despite decades of effort, it remains undeciphered, which means all those potential explanations are just sitting there, silently, being uncooperative. And that lack of written clarity leaves room for interpretation. So naturally, over time, people have come up with all sorts of theories. Some are reasonable, some are enthusiastic. Let's gently walk through a few of the more grounded ideas. One possibility is that shifting river systems didn't just affect agriculture, they also influenced migration patterns. As rivers moved or dried up, people followed water sources. Settlements relocated. Trade routes adjusted. Over generations, this creates a slow but steady redistribution of population. Not a collapse, just a reshuffling. Another idea focuses on environmental stress combined with overuse of resources. As populations grew during the civilization's peak, the demand for land, water, and materials increased. If environmental conditions then became less favorable, the system might have struggled to sustain itself at the same scale. It's a bit like hosting a very large, very well-organized gathering and then slowly running out of snacks. At first, it's fine. Then people start noticing, and eventually they leave. Calmly, politely. But they leave. There's also the question of health. Some researchers have suggested that changing environmental conditions, like increased flooding or stagnant water, could have contributed to the spread of disease. Nothing dramatic or cinematic, just conditions becoming less ideal. And when life becomes less comfortable, people tend to adjust their surroundings, or move, or both. Now, earlier theories about invasions, particularly the idea of Indo-Aryan groups sweeping in and destroying the civilization, have largely fallen out of favor. Mostly because there's no strong archaeological evidence to support a large-scale violent takeover. No widespread destruction layers. No sudden cultural replacement. Instead, what we see is continuity with change, which is much less dramatic, but also much more realistic. Now, let's take a slow, imaginary walk through one of these later settlements. It's smaller than the cities of the past, less structured, maybe a bit more improvised. The houses aren't as standardized. The layout isn't as precise. But there's life. People are still working, still building, still adapting. Children are growing up without ever knowing the scale of what came before. For them, this is just normal. And that's something we often forget when we talk about collapse. From the inside, it doesn't always feel like the end of something. It just feels like life changing, gradually, quietly, without a clear moment where anyone says, "This is it. This is the end of our civilization." Because no one really announces that. Now, if we zoom out very gently, we can see that this pattern isn't unique to the Indus Valley. Other civilizations have gone through similar slow transformations. Not all at once. Not for a single reason, but through a combination of environmental shifts, economic changes, and human adaptation. It's almost comforting in a slightly unsettling way, because it suggests that civilizations are not as solid as they appear. They're more like systems of habits. And when enough of those habits change, the system changes too. Now, before we drift too far into philosophical territory, let's bring it back to something a little more grounded. The legacy of the Indus Valley Civilization. Even though its urban phase faded, its influence likely carried forward into later cultures in South Asia. Certain agricultural practices, craft traditions, possibly even aspects of social organization. It's not always easy to trace directly. History, unfortunately, doesn't come with neat labels, but the continuity is there if you look closely enough. Which means that while the cities of Harappa and Mohenjo-daro may have fallen silent, the people did not. They kept going. Quietly, adaptively, humanly. And maybe that's the most understated part of this entire story. Not the rise, not even the collapse, but the in-between, the long, gentle transition where everything changes and yet life continues. So as we slowly move forward, we'll start to explore how this kind of quiet transformation fits into a larger pattern. Because the Indus Valley wasn't alone in this. And humanity, as it turns out, has a long history of slowly drifting away from its own creations while pretending everything is still completely under control. Which, of course, it always is. Until it isn't. Let's keep going. Alright, we're still here. The cities have faded into something softer. The grand urban rhythm has slowed. And the people who never really asked for dramatic endings in the first place have simply adjusted. Which, if we're being honest, is kind of humanity's default setting. So now we find ourselves in this in-between space. Not quite the Indus Valley Civilization as it once was, but not something entirely new either. Just continuity in a slightly different outfit. Let's ease into what that actually looked like. Imagine a small settlement somewhere to the east, beyond the old urban centers. Not as meticulously planned as Mohenjo-daro, not as structured as Harappa, but still very much alive. There are houses simpler now, a bit more varied in shape and size. Built with local materials, adjusted to local needs. No strict grid. No quiet obsession with symmetry. Just practicality. People wake up early. They tend to crops. They manage water sources as best they can. Maybe a well here, a small canal there. Nothing too ambitious. Ambition at this point has probably learned to be a little more cautious. And honestly, fair enough. Because after generations of dealing with rivers that change their minds and climates that slowly shift, you start to appreciate systems that are flexible. Less impressive, but more forgiving. Now, something interesting happens when large, centralized systems fade. Decision-making becomes a local. There's no distant authority setting standards for weights, measures, or city layouts. No unified approach to building or planning. Instead, each community figures things out in its own way, which leads to variation. A lot of variation. Pottery styles begin to differ more noticeably from one region to another. Construction techniques adapt to specific environments. Even daily routines might shift depending on what works best locally. It's less cohesive, but also more adaptable. And while historians might look at this and think, The system is breaking down. The people living it are probably thinking, this works for now, which is usually good enough. Now let's talk very gently about memory. Because one of the quietest aspects of this entire transition is how the memory of the great cities likely faded over time. At first, of course, people would remember. There would be stories. Maybe a parent telling a child, "We used to live in a place where the streets were perfectly straight and the drains worked better than they do here." And the child would probably nod politely while thinking, that sounds like a lot of effort. But as generations pass, those memories soften. Details blur. Stories become stories. And eventually, the cities become something distant, almost mythical. Not in a dramatic, legendary way. Just something that used to be, which is a strangely gentle kind of forgetting. No deliberate erasure. Just time doing what it does best. Now, let's float for a moment over to the idea of resilience. Because if there's one thing this whole slow transition shows, it's that people are remarkably good at continuing. Even when systems fail, even when environments shift, even when the comfortable structures of daily life quietly fall apart, they adapt. They simplify. They carry forward what still works and leave behind what doesn't. And they do it without necessarily calling it resilience. They just call it living. Now, from our modern perspective, it's tempting to look back and label this as a collapse. A neat category, a clear endpoint. But from within the experience, it probably felt much less defined. No one was sitting around saying, "Ah, yes, we are currently in the late phase of a major civilizational decline." That's not really how people talk. Instead, it was likely a series of small realizations. The harvest wasn't as good this year. The river's behaving strangely again. Trade goods aren't arriving like they used to. Maybe we should move closer to that other water source. Each decision makes sense on its own. Each adjustment feels reasonable. And over time, those small changes add up to something much larger. A transformation. Not planned. Not coordinated. Just emergent. Now, let's gently consider something a bit ironic. The Indus Valley Civilization was, in many ways, defined by its organization, its standardization, its careful planning, and yet its ending, or rather its transformation, was the opposite. Unplanned, unstandardized, a gradual loosening of structure. It's almost like the system that made it strong also made it a little rigid, and when conditions changed, that rigidity became harder to maintain. So it softened. And then it dispersed, which, again, feels very human. We build systems to create stability. But when the world shifts, those systems have to shift too. And if they can't, we find other ways. Now, before we drift too far into quiet reflection, let's bring in one more subtle thread. Connection. Even as the large urban networks weakened, people didn't become completely isolated. There were still interactions between communities, still exchanges of goods, ideas, and probably the occasional mildly dramatic opinion about neighboring villages. Because humans rarely operate in complete isolation. We like to stay connected, even if the scale of that connection changes. So instead of vast trade networks stretching across regions, we get smaller, more localized exchanges. Less impressive, but still meaningful. And over time, these smaller networks lay the groundwork for future developments. Because history doesn't really have hard resets. It's more like a continuous flow with occasional shifts in direction. And the Indus Valley's quiet transition becomes part of that larger flow. Now, let's take one last slow walk through the remains of a once great city. The bricks are still there, carefully made, remarkably durable. The streets still follow their grid, even if they're no longer maintained. The drainage systems, those quietly impressive feats of engineering, are still visible, even if they're no longer in use. There's a sense of order, lingering, like the echo of a system that once worked very, very well. And then, gradually, nature begins to reclaim the space. Dust settles, vegetation grows, time moves on, and the city becomes a memory in the landscape, waiting for someone, thousands of years later, to come along and say, this was something important. Which, of course, it was, even if it didn't end with a dramatic finale. So, as we continue this slow, calm journey, we'll start to gently connect this story to a broader pattern. Because the Indus Valley Civilization isn't just an isolated case. It's part of a much larger, very human tendency to build, to organize, to thrive, and then to slowly, quietly change. Not with a bang, but with a soft, almost polite fade into something new. And somehow that makes it even more fascinating. Let's keep going slowly. All right, let's keep drifting. By now, the cities are quiet. The people have spread out. Life has softened into something smaller, more local, more manageable. And if you listen closely, very closely, you can almost hear a familiar pattern forming. Because the story of the Indus Valley Civilization isn't just about one place or one time. It's about something humans do over and over again. We build something impressive. We organize it beautifully. We rely on it completely. And then, when the conditions shift just enough, we slowly start pretending everything is still fine. Which, to be fair, is a very relatable strategy. Now, let's gently step back and look at the bigger picture. At its peak, the Indus Valley Civilization had all the ingredients of a successful system. Urban planning, trade networks, agricultural stability, and a level of coordination that, let's be honest, was quietly impressive. But like any system, it depended on balance. Water needed to flow in predictable ways. Climate needed to behave itself. Trade needed to remain steady. Communities needed to stay connected. And when that balance started to wobble even slightly, everything else began to feel it. Not immediately, not dramatically, just gradually. It's a bit like a perfectly balanced stack of bricks. Remove one, nothing happens. Shift another, still fine. But keep adjusting, keep nudging, keep changing small things, and eventually the structure doesn't collapse in a dramatic crash. It just settles into something else. Less stable, less tall, less what it used to be. Now here's where things get quietly ironic. The Indus Valley people were very good at planning. They designed cities with precision. They managed water with care. They created systems that worked across large areas. And yet, the thing they couldn't fully plan for was change itself, which, again, feels very human. We're excellent at organizing the present, slightly less excellent at predicting the future, especially when the future decides to shift slowly without making a big announcement. Now let's talk softly about adaptation again. Because if there's one thing that stands out in this entire story, it's that people didn't just give up. They adjusted. They moved to areas with more reliable water. They shifted their farming practices. They built smaller, more flexible communities. They let go of certain systems and held on to others. And they did it without needing a grand narrative. No one stood up and said, "We are now entering a new phase of decentralized rural adaptation." That's more of a modern historian thing. Instead, it was probably more like, "This isn't working anymore. Let's try something else." Which is, honestly, a perfectly reasonable approach to most problems. Now, let's gently consider something else.
Time.
Because one of the reasons this collapse feels so different is that it didn't happen within a single lifetime. It stretched across generations. A person born during the early stages of decline might have still experienced a relatively functioning urban system. Their children might have seen it weaken. Their grandchildren might have grown up in a completely different environment, smaller settlements, less coordination, more localized living. And for that third generation, there's no sense of loss, no memory of what used to be, just reality. And that's how transformations become normalized, not through sudden change, but through gradual adjustment. Now, if we gently shift our focus again, we can see how this story fits into a broader human rhythm. Civilizations rise. They organize. They expand. And then, for a variety of reasons, environmental, economic, social, they change. Sometimes quickly. Sometimes very, very slowly. The Indus Valley just happens to be one of the more subtle examples. No dramatic ending. No clear villain. Just a collection of small pressures that, over time, reshaped everything. And maybe that's why it feels a little more real. Because most things in life don't end with a clear conclusion. They fade. They transition. They become something else. Now, let's take a moment to appreciate the strange quietness of it all. No grand ruins of fallen palaces. No inscriptions mourning the end of an era. No dramatic legends about the final days. Just empty cities. Carefully built. Carefully abandoned. And a script that still won't tell us what happened. Which, if we're being slightly sarcastic about it, feels like the ultimate historical cliffhanger. Here's a complex, fascinating civilization. History says it thrived, it adapted, and then it slowly changed into something else. Why? Good question. And that's it. No follow-up. No detailed explanation. Just silence. Now, before we drift too far into quiet frustration, let's gently bring things toward a kind of soft landing. Because while the Indus Valley Civilization as a distinct urban system may have faded, its legacy didn't vanish. Its people continued. Its practices evolved. Its influence likely blended into the cultures that followed in the region. And, in that sense, it never truly ended. It just stopped being recognizable in the way we expect. Which, again, feels very human. We like clear identities, clear beginnings and endings. But reality tends to blur those lines. Now, let's take one final, slow look at the pattern. A civilization rises, built on cooperation, resources, and careful planning. It thrives for centuries. Then the environment shifts. The systems strain. People adapt. And slowly, quietly, the structure transforms. Not into nothing, but into something different. Less centralized. Less visible. Alright, we're still drifting. The cities are long quiet now. The neat grids of Mohenjo-daro and Harappa have settled into the landscape, doing that calm, dignified thing ruins do, where they just exist without explaining themselves. Which, to be fair, is a bit rude, but also very on-brand. Now we're in the phase that historians sometimes struggle to describe without sounding slightly disappointed. Because nothing exciting is happening. No dramatic rise of a new empire immediately replacing the old one. No legendary ruler stepping in with a speech and a plan. Just continuation. Quiet, practical, slightly improvised continuation. And honestly, this might be the most realistic part of the whole story. Because after something large and organized fades, what remains isn't emptiness. It's habits. People keep doing things the way they know how, just in different settings. Pottery styles shift, but you can still see echoes of earlier designs. Tools evolve, but the basic ideas remain. Agricultural practices adapt to new conditions, but they don't start from scratch. It's like moving to a new house and bringing your old routines with you. You might rearrange the furniture, but you still make tea the same way. Now, let's gently talk about movement. Because one of the key features of this post-urban phase is migration. Not dramatic, sweeping migration, but slow, steady relocation. People followed water. Because of course they did. As river systems changed, communities adjusted their positions. Some moved toward the Ganges Plains, where conditions were becoming more favorable. Others stayed, adapting to local environments as best they could. And over time, this movement reshaped the population landscape of the region. Not in a neat, organized way, more like a gradual spreading out. Which makes it harder for us, thousands of years later, to trace clear lines. Historians love clear lines. History, unfortunately, prefers smudges. Now, somewhere in this long transition, something else quietly happens. Cultural blending. As communities move and interact, they exchange ideas, practices, and little everyday habits. Cooking methods, building styles, ways of organizing daily life. None of it dramatic, none of it recorded in a grand historical text, but all of it slowly shaping what comes next. And this is where the Indus Valley Civilization becomes less of a clearly defined entity and more of a quiet influence. A background presence. Still there, just not obvious. Now let's pause for a moment and consider something slightly ironic. For a civilization that left behind such carefully planned cities, its legacy is surprisingly subtle. No towering monuments shouting its achievements. No long inscriptions explaining its philosophy. Just traces, patterns, clues, and a script that continues to sit there, calmly refusing to cooperate, which, again, feels like history being just a little bit smug. Oh, you want answers? It seems to say. That's adorable. Now, let's gently return to the people themselves. Because it's easy to talk about civilizations in abstract terms, systems, structures, networks. But at the center of all of this were individuals. People waking up each day and making decisions based on what made sense at the time. Where to live, what to grow, how to build, whether to stay or leave. And those decisions, multiplied across thousands of lives and several generations, created the transformation we now call a collapse. Which, when you think about it, feels a little unfair. Calling it a collapse makes it sound like failure. But from the perspective of the people living through it, it was probably just adaptation. Life adjusting to new conditions. Because humans are very good at that. We don't always do it perfectly. We complain. We hesitate. We sometimes make things worse before making them better. But we adapt. Even if it's slow. Even if it's messy. Even if it doesn't look impressive from the outside. Now, let's take one more slow look at the broader pattern. The Indus Valley Civilization didn't end in fire. It didn't collapse under the weight of a single catastrophe. It shifted, gradually, quietly, through a series of small changes that, over time, reshaped everything. And in doing so, it became something less visible, but still very much part of the human story. Now here's a soft, slightly snarky thought to drift off with. If this had happened in a more dramatic civilization, one full of kings and inscriptions and very confident declarations, we might have a detailed account of its decline. Something like, the river betrayed us. The harvest failed. The gods were clearly having a moment, but the Indus Valley people? They left us with bricks, carefully arranged bricks, and a mystery, which is in its own quiet way kind of elegant. No complaints, no dramatic last words, just evidence. And the gentle suggestion that sometimes the biggest changes don't come with explanations. They just happen, and people adjust. So as we slowly come to the end of this long, calm journey, we're left with a picture that feels less like a story with a clear ending and more like a moment in an ongoing process. A civilization rises. It organizes. It thrives. And then when conditions shift, it transforms. Not into nothing, but into something quieter. Something harder to see, something that blends into what comes next. And maybe that's the most comforting part, because it means that even when structures fade, people continue. Habits continue. Life continues. Softly. Steadily. All right, just a little further. By now, everything has softened into memory. The cities are no longer cities. The systems are no longer systems. And the people, well, they've carried on so naturally that the idea of a civilization ending would probably feel a bit dramatic to them. Which is ironic because here we are thousands of years later, gently overanalyzing it. As we do. Now, let's settle into one final stretch of this slow, steady story. Because what's left isn't just ruins or migration patterns or slightly uncooperative rivers. What's left is a pattern. A very human pattern. And the Indus Valley just happens to be one of the clearest, quietest examples of it. We already saw how things didn't fall apart all at once. There was no single moment where everything stopped working. Instead, there were small shifts, environmental, economic, social, that slowly changed the shape of everyday life. And people responded the way people usually do. They adapted just enough. They adjusted just enough. They kept going just enough. And that just enough carried them forward. Now here's where it gets a little gently uncomfortable, because this pattern isn't locked in the past. It's not something that only ancient civilizations experienced. It's something that shows up again and again, in different forms, in different places, across time. We build systems. We rely on them. We assume they'll keep working. And when they start to shift, quietly, gradually, we don't always notice right away. Or we notice, and then politely ignore it for a while. Because dealing with slow change is inconvenient. It's much easier to respond to something dramatic. A sudden crisis. A clear problem. Something that demands attention. But slow change? That's trickier. It doesn't shout. It just lingers. And so we adapt around it, just like the people of the Indus Valley likely did. Now, let's not turn this into a dramatic warning or anything like that. That would ruin the whole calm, sleepy vibe we've carefully built. Instead, think of it more as a quiet observation, a gentle pattern that repeats. Civilizations aren't fixed things. They're ongoing processes, collections of habits, systems, and choices that work until they need to change. And when they change, they don't always announce it. They just become something else. Now, let's drift back for a moment, just for a soft, final look. Imagine standing at the edge of Mohenjo-daro again, not as it was at its peak, but as it slowly became what it is now. The streets are still there, but quieter. The buildings still stand, but emptier. The carefully designed systems still exist, but no longer serve their original purpose. There's no sense of panic, no dramatic ending, just stillness. And if you listen, really listen, you can almost feel the transition. Not an ending, just a pause in one form of life before another continues elsewhere. Now, imagine the people who once lived there. They didn't disappear. They moved. They adapted. They carried their knowledge with them. And somewhere in smaller settlements, in new environments, they kept living, kept building, kept figuring things out, which, in a way, is the most quietly reassuring part of this entire story. Because it means that even when something as large as a civilization changes shape, the human part continues without much interruption. No grand speeches required. Now, let's gently acknowledge one last detail. The mystery. Because for all our careful observation, all our archaeological evidence, all our educated guesses, we still don't have a single clear answer. No definitive explanation. No final piece that neatly completes the puzzle. And maybe that's okay. Because not every story needs a clean ending. Some stories are better understood as processes. Ongoing, evolving, slightly unclear processes. And the Indus Valley Civilization is one of those stories. It doesn't end. It transforms. It disperses. It continues in quieter ways. And it leaves behind just enough evidence to remind us that something remarkable once existed without fully explaining itself. Which, if we're being just a little bit sarcastic about it, feels like history's way of keeping things interesting. Here's a beautifully organized civilization. It says, it thrived for centuries. And then, you figure it out. And we're still trying, calmly, patiently, with a lot of careful guesses. Now, as we ease toward the end of this long, slow journey, you can let the story settle. No dramatic conclusion, no final twist, just a soft understanding that the collapse of the Indus Valley Civilization wasn't really a collapse at all. It was a transition, a quiet, gradual shift from one way of living to another. And like most things in life, it happened one small change at a time. All right, now you can really let go of the story. Let it drift off, like a river doing exactly what it wants without explaining itself. And somehow that feels just right. All right, just a little more drifting. At this point, the story has done that quiet thing where it stops feeling like a story and starts feeling like a landscape. Nothing is happening quickly. Nothing is demanding attention. Everything is just there, settled,
soft,
a little unfinished, in a very intentional way. And maybe that's exactly how the end of the Indus Valley Civilization should feel, because it never really gave us a clean ending to begin with. Now, let's gently sit with what remains. The cities, Mohenjo-daro, Harappa, have become quiet shapes in the earth. Their straight lines still visible, their bricks still holding together after thousands of years, which is honestly impressive. You have to respect a civilization that made bricks this reliable, even if everything else eventually drifted apart. The streets no longer guide busy crowds. The drainage systems no longer carry away the routines of daily life. The wells no longer gather voices in the morning, but they're still there. Not broken in a dramatic way, just unused, which somehow feels more peaceful. Now imagine standing there, not as an archaeologist, not as a historian trying to solve a puzzle, but just as someone passing through. There's no sign saying this is where it ended. No marker indicating the final moment, because there wasn't one. And that's what makes this whole story feel different. Most historical narratives like to point to a specific event, a battle,
a disaster,
a decision, something you can circle and say, that's where everything changed. But here, there's no circle, just a long, gradual shift, like watching daylight fade into evening without ever noticing the exact second it became night. Now, let's gently return to the people one last time, because they are, quietly, the entire point of this. They didn't vanish. They didn't leave behind dramatic last words or desperate attempts to hold everything together. They just kept going. They moved when they needed to move. They adapted when they needed to adapt. They built smaller lives when the larger system no longer made sense. And in doing so, they carried the essence of their civilization forward without needing to preserve its exact shape, which is a very human kind of continuity. We don't always hold on to structures, but we hold on to habits, ways of doing things, ways of thinking, ways of living, and those are much harder to erase. Now, there's something quietly comforting in that, because it means that even when something as large as a civilization fades from view, it doesn't disappear completely. It lingers, in subtle ways, in everyday actions, in traditions that evolve over time without anyone necessarily noticing where they began. Now, let's touch, very lightly, on one final idea: perspective. From far away, looking back across thousands of years, we call this a collapse. It fits neatly into our need for categories.
Rise, peak, fall.
It makes the story feel complete. But from up close, from within the experience itself, it likely felt nothing like that. No one wakes up and says, yes, today we begin the collapse of our civilization. It's more like the river's acting strange again, or maybe we should move closer to that other water source, or this place isn't working like it used to. Small thoughts, practical decisions, quiet adjustments. And those quiet adjustments are what shape history far more often than dramatic moments. Now, as we slowly bring this to a close, there's no need for a grand conclusion. That wouldn't really fit the tone of the story anyway. Instead, just imagine the region as it settles into its new rhythm. Smaller communities, shifting patterns of life, people continuing as they always do, and the old cities resting in the background, their purpose complete, their presence still felt but no longer central. Not forgotten, just moved past. And maybe that's the softest kind of ending there is. Not a disappearance, not a destruction, but a quiet step into something else. Something less visible but still very much alive. So as you let this story drift away, you can leave it without needing a final answer, without needing a single cause or a neat explanation. Just a gentle understanding that the Indus Valley Civilization didn't really collapse. It changed. Slowly. Quietly. Naturally. Like a river, adjusting its path over time, without asking for permission, and without explaining itself. And somewhere, far in the background, that river is still flowing.
Calm.
Unbothered. Doing exactly what it has always done. All right, now you can rest. The story has already moved on. All right, just one last, very gentle drift. By now, the story has already ended in the quietest possible way. The people adapted. The cities softened into stillness. The systems dissolved into smaller, simpler rhythms. And life, calmly, stubbornly, continued somewhere else. And for a very long time, that was it. No one came back to explain it. No one left behind a neat summary. Just land, dust, and a few very well-made bricks waiting patiently. For centuries, actually for millennia, these places simply existed without commentary. The outlines of Mohenjo-daro and Harappa remained buried, quiet, and completely uninterested in being rediscovered, which, honestly, must have been a very peaceful existence. No historians debating you. No theories being projected onto your ruins. Just stillness. But eventually, as humans tend to do, we started looking.
Carefully.
Curiously. Slightly obsessively. And when archaeologists began uncovering these sites in the 19th and early 20th centuries, there was a moment of quiet surprise. Because this wasn't supposed to be here. Not like this. A vast, organized urban civilization with no obvious kings, no monumental ego projects, no readable texts explaining itself. It didn't quite fit the usual pattern, which, of course, made it immediately fascinating. Exciting even. Though we'll keep that excitement very calm, because we've come this far without raising our voices. Now imagine those early archaeologists brushing away layers of dust and finding order. Straight streets, standardized bricks, drainage systems that were, slightly annoyingly, very well designed. It must have felt like uncovering a conversation that had been paused mid-sentence. A civilization that had simply stepped away. And now here we are, trying to pick up where it left off, without really knowing what it was saying in the first place. Now let's gently sit with that idea for a moment, because it's one of the most quietly humbling parts of this entire story. We have all this evidence.
Cities. Tools.
Artifacts. Layouts. We can see how they lived, how they built, how they organized themselves. But we can't hear them. We don't know what they thought about their own lives. We don't know how they felt as things slowly changed. We don't know if they even saw it as a decline or just a series of normal adjustments. And that gap, that silence, is where all our questions live. which is why the Indus Valley Civilization continues to feel like a mystery. Not because nothing is known, but because just enough is known to make us curious without giving us closure. Now, of course, over time, we've developed theories. Careful, evidence-based, very reasonable theories.
Climate change.
River shifts, economic transformation, gradual migration. All of them make sense. All of them fit the pieces we have. But none of them stand up and say, this is the answer. And maybe that's the most honest outcome, because real life rarely offers a single, satisfying explanation. It offers layers, possibilities, quiet probabilities. Now let's gently consider something else. Why this story still matters. Because it would be easy to look at all of this and think, well, that happened a very long time ago in a very different world. And that's true. But the pattern, the slow change, the gradual adaptation, the quiet transformation is not unique to the past. It's something that shows up again and again, not always on the scale of a civilization, but in smaller systems, communities, even individual lives. Things don't always end suddenly. They shift. They evolve. They become something else, often before we fully notice. And the Indus Valley just happens to be a very old, very well-preserved example of that process. Now, as we ease toward the final edge of this story, there's no need to solve it. No need to pick a single theory or force a conclusion. Instead, just let it exist as it is. A quiet mystery, a slow transformation, a civilization that didn't fall so much as it gently stepped aside and left behind just enough for us to wonder. So if you imagine standing there one last time, on those ancient streets, surrounded by careful brickwork and soft, lingering silence, you don't need to ask, what happened here? You can just notice that something did. Something complex. Something gradual. Something very human. And maybe that's enough. Alright, now we can finally let the story rest. No dramatic ending. No final reveal. Just a soft fade into history where the river keeps flowing and the answers remain exactly where they've always been. Quietly out of reach. Alright, just one last, very gentle drift. By now, the story has already ended in the quietest possible way. The people adapted. The cities softened into stillness. The systems dissolved into smaller, simpler rhythms. And life, calmly, stubbornly, continued somewhere else. And for a very long time, that was it. No one came back to explain it. No one left behind a neat summary. Just land, dust, and a few very well-made bricks waiting patiently. For centuries, actually for millennia, these places simply existed without commentary. The outlines of Mohenjo-daro and Harappa remained buried, quiet, and completely uninterested in being rediscovered. Which, honestly, must have been a very peaceful existence. No historians debating you. No theories being projected onto your ruins. Just stillness. But eventually, as humans tend to do, we started looking.
Carefully. Curiously.
Slightly obsessively. And when archaeologists began uncovering these sites in the 19th and early 20th centuries, there was a moment of quiet surprise. Because this wasn't supposed to be here. Not like this. A vast, organized urban civilization with no obvious kings, no monumental ego projects, no readable texts explaining itself. It didn't quite fit the usual pattern, which, of course, made it immediately fascinating, exciting even. Though we'll keep that excitement very calm, because we've come this far without raising our voices. Now imagine those early archaeologists brushing away layers of dust and finding order. Straight streets, standardized bricks, drainage systems that were, slightly annoyingly, very well designed. It must have felt like uncovering a conversation that had been paused mid-sentence. A civilization that had simply stepped away. And now here we are, trying to pick up where it left off, without really knowing what it was saying in the first place. Now let's gently sit with that idea for a moment, because it's one of the most quietly humbling parts of this entire story. We have all this evidence.
Cities, tools,
Artifacts, layouts. We can see how they lived, how they built, how they organized themselves. But we can't hear them. We don't know what they thought about their own lives. We don't know how they felt as things slowly changed. We don't know if they even saw it as a decline or just a series of normal adjustments. And that gap, that silence, is where all our questions live, which is why the Indus Valley Civilization continues to feel like a mystery. Not because nothing is known, but because just enough is known to make us curious without giving us closure. Now, of course, over time, we've developed theories. Careful, evidence-based, very reasonable theories.
climate change,
River shifts, economic transformation, gradual migration. All of them make sense. All of them fit the pieces we have. But none of them stand up and say, this is the answer. And maybe that's the most honest outcome, because real life rarely offers a single, satisfying explanation. It offers layers, possibilities, quiet probabilities. Now let's gently consider something else. Why this story still matters. Because it would be easy to look at all of this and think, well, that happened a very long time ago in a very different world. And that's true. But the pattern, the slow change, the gradual adaptation, the quiet transformation is not unique to the past. It's something that shows up again and again. Not always on the scale of a civilization, but in smaller systems, communities, even individual lives. Things don't always end suddenly. They shift. They evolve. They become something else, often before we fully notice. And the Indus Valley just happens to be a very old, very well-preserved example of that process. Now, as we ease toward the final edge of this story, there's no need to solve it. No need to pick a single theory or force a conclusion. Instead, just let it exist as it is. A quiet mystery, a slow transformation, a civilization that didn't fall so much as it gently stepped aside and left behind just enough for us to wonder. So if you imagine standing there one last time, on those ancient streets, surrounded by careful brickwork and soft, lingering silence, you don't need to ask, what happened here? You can just notice that something did. Something complex. Something gradual. Something very human. And maybe that's enough. Alright, now we can finally let the story rest. No dramatic ending. No final reveal. Just a soft fade into history where the river keeps flowing and the answers remain exactly where they've always been. Quietly out of reach. Alright, this is where we let everything settle. No new details. No new theories. Just a soft return to where we've been and a quiet place to leave it. Because the story of the Indus Valley Civilization was never really about a single moment. It was about time.
slow time,
the kind that doesn't rush, the kind that doesn't announce itself, the kind that quietly reshapes everything while no one is really paying attention. And now, as we come to the end, you can almost feel that slow time stretching out behind us. The rise of carefully planned cities, the calm confidence of systems that worked, the gentle shift as conditions changed, the quiet decisions made by people who were just trying to live their lives, and then the soft transition into something else. No sharp edges, no sudden drop, just a gradual fading of one shape into another. If you drift back just one last time to Mohenjo-daro or Harappa, you don't have to imagine them at their peak. You can imagine them in between, not fully alive, not fully gone, just changing. A street that used to be busy, now quieter. A house that once held a family, now holding less. A system that once worked perfectly, now working just enough. And then, eventually, not at all. But even then, nothing truly stops. Because the people are already somewhere else. Building smaller homes. Following new water sources. Adapting to new rhythms. Living lives that feel completely normal to them, even if they're very different from what came before. And that's the part that lingers. Not the fall. Not the mystery. But the continuation. Now let's gently step even further back. Far enough that the details blur. Far enough that the cities become shapes. The people become movement. The story becomes a pattern.
Something that repeats.
Something that doesn't need a dramatic ending to be meaningful. Because meaning isn't always found in conclusions. Sometimes it's found in the way things change, the way they soften, the way they quietly become something else without asking for attention. And the Indus Valley Civilization does that beautifully. It doesn't demand to be understood. It doesn't insist on a single explanation. It just exists as a reminder that not everything ends loudly. Some things just drift. Now, there's a certain calm in that. A sense that even large, complex systems don't have to break in order to change. They can ease into something new, slowly, naturally, almost without resistance. And maybe that's why this story feels different from so many others. It doesn't leave you with tension. It doesn't leave you waiting for a final answer. It just settles. Like dust over old bricks, like water finding a new path, like a day quietly becoming night. So, as you let this final part fade out, you don't need to hold on to any specific detail. You don't need to remember dates or theories or names. You can just keep the feeling of something ancient, something thoughtful, something that existed for a long time and then gently changed. And somewhere in that feeling, there's a quiet understanding that history isn't always about endings. Sometimes it's just about movement. Slow, steady movement. From one form into another.
All right.
Now the story really does end. Or rather, it stops here, while everything else keeps going. The river flows. The land settles, and the past rests quietly where it always has.
Good night.